Hello everyone, today we talk about forests, swamps and cultivated and uncultivated areas into the early, we can say high Middle Ages. So also in here, not not a really cheap topic and nor one that is very easy to discuss. It's a topic I'm not particularly expert on, but I think it's very fascinating. It's not just really about economics, society, and technology, but it's also about culture because the wild has always suscitated certain feelings, certain fears and attraction at the same time towards man. You have to think for men in all ages of history, and you have to think. I mean, today we live usually in a highly urbanized contexts. Even when we live out of a main center, it's very difficult to be very distant from civilization, we can say. And our ancestors back in the day were completely not just inserted into this wilderness, but also in a certain sense shaping their own culture, their own beliefs, together with their own work and existence on the base of this world that in this sense affected quite strongly the same view of the world, of the same world and of the world in general, we can say. So what we want to talk about today is specifically about more of an economical aspect of these environments. Maybe on another occasion I will discuss about more cultural aspects, but I think starting from economics and society is always interesting when discussing these environmental factors. So as we were saying, we're going to discuss essentially from the early Middle Ages on, and we can say that the demographic contraction that had marked the first ages of the first centuries of the medieval era, that are sometimes called improperly as the Dark Age, were definitely had definitely an impact on the extension of the uncultivated areas, because there were simply less people that could cultivate. There had been wars, plague, the great pandemic of the 6th century, so you can imagine that all over Europe there was a contraction of the cultivated areas, and that the forest nature would take essentially would claim back many of the territories that had been in turn colonized by humans and adapted to their own needs. So this is naturally something that occurred differently into the various areas of Europe, mainly for a pre-existing objective environmental reason, the fact that essentially a sedentary civilization that lived of agriculture had spread only in certain areas of the continent. The Romans, essentially, the Roman Empire and its boundaries is a pretty good marker of this, to have an idea of the extension of this area, because the Romans expanded into regions that could practically support, without much effort, a sedentary life. So it's not a surprise that the Romans expanded and colonized only areas into which agriculture was quite profitable, into which certain usually you say that the the Roman borders essentially overlap with the vineyard cultivation, and this is true because the wine basically grows only in certain areas, and these are the same ones that to which in the Roman Empire this was possible. The Romans exported grape wine all over Europe at this point, and it is interesting to see that exactly in the measure of their borders, in the sense that if you take southwestern Germany, that is still today an area that is pretty warm, considering the temperatures, at least it's the warmest in Germany, was incidentally, and it is incidentally the only one into which in Germany today grape wine is produced, or at least it was something traditionally present from the ancient times onwards. It was because it was the only area, by the way, that the Romans had colonized, and they had colonized that area essentially for that reason, because that was a climate that could support the production of certain substances and materials, also deriving from the same grape wine, seemingly, and that's especially for the preservation of the stocks and supplies that could sustain a sedentary society. The main worry of the Romans was to support their legions, and they couldn't do that in places where they couldn't have large stocks, large supplies for feeding these their army. So you can argue that the Romans expanded all over it was possible in terms of this form of sedentary expansion. So if you see the rest of the borders, the Romans didn't make it, gave up simply Germany. Caledonia, they stopped at the borders of the desert, obviously. They remained for instance, the middle Danube, the Mysia, was the only place. Usually the Danubian lands of the Roman Empire weren't very developed, but one of the most developed was the Mysian one, because it had a particular local climate that had allowed a great expansion in agriculture that had in turn support the Roman cities that were the backbone of the empire, and so on. So when the Roman Empire fell in the West, and however in general it's not much about the fall of the Roman Empire, because even in in Gothic Spain or Italy, the Roman civilization in this sense remained intact until the Justinian's plague in the 6th century, and even in the Byzantine Empire there was a demographic contraction of that kind. Those were, however, the areas that saw a greater regression, in the sense that where the humans had not essentially cultivated, nature had remained essentially how it was, relatively how it was before, or at least cultivated areas hadn't made a difference in this sense. And therefore the main regression that is also probably better historically documented is in those areas that had been of southern Europe, generally speaking, when people they wrote more because they were on average more educated, and about which we know really much more. We don't know what was we know with much greater difficulty what was happening in Scandinavia or Russia, or than I don't know, in Italy or even in parts of Gaul. In this sense, you can find a sort of neat division between what we can call southern and northern Europe, because essentially during the Middle Ages this difference was kind of increased, especially after the 11th century, when northern Europe began to be in this sense to see a true solid and structural expansion of agriculture like in the south, and yet with different environmental conditions, and you can see how the different societies specialize into different productions, into different lifestyles, to different even sheltering and all, because temperature really does make a difference. We don't have to give it as the technological potential of those times was very, very low. I mean, the sources of, compared to ours, of course, the sources of energy were the ones everywhere, and the same everywhere, and in this sense, even a substantial temperature difference could make a difference between the developing of a sedentary society and having a sort of semi-nomadic one. Germany is probably the best example into this, because it is true that at the end of the migration era, the Germanic populations in Central Europe began to kind of settle down, to begin especially developing in livestock and building something that was a bit larger in terms of settlements than the ancient Germanic villages, but it was something very progressive, and you can argue that until the 13th century Germany was very wild in many ways. It took feudalism in its most advanced form to eventually manage to carry out bonifications and the expansion of cultivated areas. And not that there hadn't been some forms of colonization, like the Franks had colonized even before the Carolingian times parts of western and southern Germany, but a very few could be practically done with the potential of the time. But we shall touch this topic also later. And if we're not talking about Eastern Europe, that was obviously also still very primitively organized compared to Southern and Western Europe, definitely on a quite big scale proportion. In these societies that saw the contraction of great trade traffics, essentially the shrinking of the population into to numbers that in a certain sense that in a certain sense resolved certain problems, certain feeding problems that had been proper of the late antique era. Because if this is paradoxical in some ways, and it's not always true, but let's say that the less people there are, and in proportion, in absolute terms, in considering the amount of resources, those resources are gonna be split up at least per capita in a higher quantity, which also depends by. This is not always true even in a theoretical environmental and mathematical relation. This has also to do obviously with the forms of local organization of society, where societies were very different in this sense. If you take, for instance, Gaul and Italy, these two areas were fairly wealthy, fairly rich areas at the time. Gaul was the richest country in Europe in terms of sheer amount of resources, because agriculture, France has these huge agricultural resources that have always, especially in pre-industrial times, have really made the difference in terms of the availability of resources for the construction of a more solid state and all, while Italy was the richest country per capita, in the sense that in Gaul, already from ancient times, from early medieval times, there were a few guys at the top that were very wealthy, and even before the Carolingian times, and the average population being relatively poor. In Italy, a very few guys had a lot of money, especially in the Lombard kingdom, and the middle classes, we can say, were rather wealthy. They were relatively well off, being the richest. The Italians being the richest people in the globe per capita on average. This is quite interesting because it shows how really eventually societies can develop in different ways, even at with a kind of fixed amount of resources. So here politics kind of kicks in quite prevalently. If you I will talk one day of the differences between Gaul and Italy in this sense, because I think it's a very meaningful example. But in this world, into which obviously also cities were crumbling, you have to think the Roman cities at this point couldn't simply ruined, not much because of destructions or wars, like the dramatic aspect of this was surely present up to a certain point, especially in the late antique times more than the early medieval ones. At least depending on the region also here. But they got ruined simply because there weren't the resources to make those infrastructures working anymore. I mean, why do you have to keep up an aqueduct that is meant to serve hundreds of thousands of people if these people do not exist anymore physically? Like, there are very few people who can easily drink from local waters and all. I mean, even urbanistically speaking, because in certain regions of Europe, cities completely eclipsed, even if they remained as small centers. Other cities kept living on, meaning that the people kept living at least within the old city ring, the city walls. Well, what you see here is that from the Roman city, people began to shift towards the rivers that were usually also quite swampy areas. In Roman cities and suburbs having not really developed towards that direction. But hey, aqueducts didn't work anymore. The only way to get water easily, which is basically the first human need, is to build your house next to the river. Then obviously this caused when there were floods, this caused problems. But it was still the most convenient thing to do. I mean, there is a logic into this that is much stronger than what we modern can imagine, because these people really never fall into very easy mistake of considering yourself more intelligent or more capable than someone who lived 1,000 years ago before you. And the the forests, since we're usually talking mainly talking about this, kind of were advancing, as we were saying. So they began to be first of all, people got to live in more forested areas on average. Even within the same city walls, there could be forests spreading. If you take cities like Rome, there was this huge still huge city for early medieval standards, for the actual inhabited area of the time, but it still retained this huge perimeter of the Aurelian walls that was so the surface that it encircled was so large that wide areas of it would remain essentially wild, and you could see forests spreading, wild animals coming to live in there. So the forest wasn't even something that you have to go to Northern Europe to find in this, or that you have to live the Northern Europe example was silly. I meant you don't have really to go to live in the country. I mean, there were some areas that even within the same cities in which you could find the forest as such, and the forest in this sense became a very precious resource. I would say a primary resource for early medieval societies, needs of supplies and feeding. The first and most obvious profit of the forest derived from livestock farming and hunting. In this sense, also culture was kind of evolving in many ways. I mean, when the Germanic peoples began to, sometimes we say, how was really Germanic influence so strong in areas that were predominantly and largely non-Germanic, like in Southern Europe? How did really I don't know, the Italian society transformed, the Italic society transformed into the Lombard one, and how lifestyle changed? Well, because certain regions were kind of getting more similar to the areas of origin of the Germanic rulers. So even the average people that were already obviously put under the political and cultural influence of the invaders began to imitate them in some fashion. Hunting has always been a very active, a very widespread activity, but the highly urbanized and civilized world of the Romans had kind of abandoned hunting, at least as a as a status symbol in a way. For in the Germanic societies, hunting was like the first thing, because in semi-nomadic societies that's how you prevalently get fed. Seemingly, certain Germanic peoples only ate the game, like animals hunted down, or dairy products and all, because they also considered agricultural products food for slaves, because usually it was sedentary populations that they came to conquer that worked like that. So it was even something ideologically shameful for a Germanic warrior to eat something that it was needed to be cultivated, even though factual reality was quite different, because obviously also the Germanic populations practice agriculture. It was the slaves, though, that did that, usually for freemen. But especially when the Germans, that were quite few numerically, began to occupy areas populated by millions, like in Gaul, in Italy, in Spain, they also, and obviously, began to practice agriculture on a regular base, also because the climate was more fit for doing that. So there was a lot of mixing in this process of different cultures that kind of integrated each other, and eventually mixed up, forming the medieval identity that is still at the base of national European identities in many ways, in origin. And a great thing for hunting was also the idea that the great kings, the great warriors, hunting was a way also to exercise into warfare, especially on horseback and using bow and arrow and all. So in Roman and Germanic Europe, it was even not just a way through which you could feed yourself, but also a kind of an ability that was praised as part of especially freemen. You have to think even of the presence of trees like oaks that favored the pasture of pigs. And the role of pigs into early medieval economy was crucial, was extremely important. We know from all sources available that there was a fairly high consumption of porks of pigs in the early medieval diet, even in lower classes, which is interesting, and it opens a question relatively to how better, worse were people fed in early medieval times compared to the low Middle Ages, which is not at all an easy answer to give, because like the person who has really never posed the problems or read anything can think, well, but the early medieval times were the Dark Ages, right? So they probably lived wars. They ate less. Well, as a matter of fact, this is not really true, because at this point, I mean, it's, as I said, it's difficult to answer, because from one side, as we were saying, in this more primitive early medieval society influenced by the Germanic egalitarianism, with the presence of substantial, widespread and numerous class of freemen, with a few political centralization, the individual families, the individual clans could really feed themselves better, because there were less people compared to previous times, so more resources available. There was not the evil guy, I'd say, the guy at the top that really controlled the resources of everyone, like in the feudal era later. So the idea was that by with gathering and hunting, you could have individually a much better diet, or at least a much more varied one. So even with more, and this is very important, with different elements that enriched your diet. And from which your organism definitely benefited. While in the low Middle Ages, there is the idea that here the feudal lord is really exploiting all these huge masses of peasants that eat just wheat, and that's it, essentially. They live in dear conditions. The guys at the top are much wealthier than the guys below. So, say the average is kind of different. Well, but you shouldn't stress this even too much, because first of all, in low medieval societies there were even things like, lots of people lived in the cities, especially in southern Europe. So, and we know, as a matter of fact, if you take Florence, it seems Florence, well, it's kind of winning easy, because it was the wealthiest city in the world at the time, but we know it was an extremely high consumption of wine, of meat, of cereals. I mean, Florentines were kind of the fat in a way, they were extremely well fed in this context. There were classes of craftsmen, of people who lived out of trade and all, that were, wealthy enough to afford substantial, the living conditions weren't that bad at the end of the Middle Ages compared to the early Middle Ages. So it's difficult really to say that on average people ate worse in low Middle Ages than in the early Middle Ages. And you also have to think that this ideal and romantic picture of the Germanic freeman that arrives in this beautiful, country world, so rich of resources and all, that starts working the land and has a lot of revenue from that, and can feed his family and building up a house. It's a very romantic picture. Like, the conditions were still pretty harsh. Even finding there was a lot of free space, yes, but it's not really easy to find the good terrain for working it. And then you have to need to have tools. You need to have experience. You need to be. You're still reliant on the weather. There can be famines. And your harvest can go lost. So it is true, there is the forest, there is livestock farming, there is harvest, there is gathering, but it's still a pretty harsh world, a pretty materially poor world. As a matter of fact, we know that living in the country, especially thanks to our geography, we know this, that living of all these hermites and monks went founding their communities into the wilderness. We have the picture, historically speaking, of an extremely poor and very terrible quality of life, we can say. So we shouldn't take easy sides here, like saying, yeah, it's so easy to say. It all depends on the place where you are. It all depends on how even how your society is organized. It depends on the latitude. It depends on the geographical location. It depends on in part even which culture you are, because if you are a nomad that has just settled, there are certain problems that there is certain cultural resistance sometimes to certain things. So it's not really easy, and life was definitely not easy at all at the time. Let's just say, and this is the key point here, is that many of the resources that were necessary for living really came from the forest, which in this sense was it could be a dangerous place, as we will see, but it could also be sources of life, of regeneration. I mean, even in the pagan cultures, the forest has this dual magical potential. Even in the Christian world, the forests becomes a metaphor in many ways. A geography is a brilliant example in expressing this. There is a hostile environment that is where the true Christian is really put at stake. Is struggling for survival, but here arrives the help of God, and the monk and the hermit finds a spring, finds a beautiful little green pasture where pasture not because they usually didn't, just for cultivating a piece of terrain, and he can live off of that, and all the products that he manages to produce in there are kind of a benediction of God, and this thanks to help of nature, the help of animals. In Christian geography, and here you find really together and intermingled in this sense, and on the furrow of the pagan tradition, the presence of animals like deer, like that really help the Christian in this sense. So there is this kind of dual meaning that can have the forest, like the source of life or the source of death as well, for all the dangers that were present in there. And since we're talking about pigs, and this is very important, we as we're saying, forests were good for feeding the same pigs, so they and what you find is in documents of the time is that sometimes forests were evaluated on economically speaking, because they could be property of someone, as a unit of measure on the number of pigs that the forest could feed. So that tells you how important it is. I know for sure that in the Longobards law, like I'm sure also in other Germanic laws, there is the guardian of porks has a higher life price than another normal peasant, because these men were had to be evidently skilled, and they were precious for the livestock of pigs, and therefore their life was valued, legally speaking, more than the one of others. So here it's interesting also how animals in this system played a role, and hunting, that I was saying before, was sometimes a status symbol. It was like, which kind of it was something, telling the truth, very transversal, socially speaking, because both the king and the peasant could go hunting. Obviously, the king would do that, like uh, in grand fashion with all his retinue and falcons and dogs and all, and the peasant would just go there with a bow, try to to kill some hog or something like that. And it was, and it is in this sense also a unit of measurement that we can use, historically speaking, to assess maybe the wealth of someone or his role in society. And this is important because also in the early Middle Ages and the High Middle Ages, forests were kind of opened a bit to everyone. As I was saying, there wasn't a strong central government, central authority, while towards the low and late Middle Ages, what you have is that the forest is kind of sanctioned as of someone's property, so nobody could enter there if he didn't get an allowance from the lord. There is a beautiful document once I read in, I think, in 12th century Germany, that was a message was sent by a German lord. I don't remember if it was from Thuringia, or, I mean, you have to think of these huge German forests that even today still exist and mark eventually the same boundaries between the great regional German divisions that were created on the base of how the forest had separated those communities. So to tell you how important they really were. And this lord, and what happened? This lord owned a forest. And there were in the 12th century there is a bit of more of economical dynamism, of social dynamism as well, and there were kind of bands of brigands, we can call them, who used to intrude into to certain forests where by law they couldn't access because it was private property, or maybe even public property because it could belong to the king, and they had began to hunt, to gather into his forest. And the funny thing, there's really nothing much funny about it, but it tells you how important this was from an economical point of view. That this lord let those brigands know that if he had found them into his forest again, he would have slaughtered them all, and seemingly they got away because of that. Because really, forests made up this great, really great, an important element into high medieval economy. And you see, in fact, that in the lower Middle Ages, legislations tended to create monopolies for the elite, and at that point, forests were closed to the commoners, to people who, simply were in this sense in the lower strata of society. And you have to think also of the variety of the animals that lived into the forests. Obviously, Europe is big; it has many different climatic bands, very different landscapes, and also there is really a big variety of animals that inhabit European forests, and you have to think how wealthy, and there could be ferocious animals as well, so danger, but think about, all the different nutrition that you could get from all of these different animals. That's very important. I mean, it's not, we all know that a healthy diet is not really how much calories you absorb, but how actually differentiated substances you assume and how balanced they are relatively to the needs of your organism. So these early medieval and early and high medieval communities kind of integrated all these elements together to eventually have, even through tradition, experience that eventually experience that translated into tradition and wisdom. The still part survives today into the peasant proverbs and all these things, that they knew, how first of all, how to access these resources, the right time of the year, how what were the habits of certain animals, or where that particular plant grew and all. That really reflect how those societies in those times were aware of that knowledge, and how much they relied in this sense on that knowledge to survive and to live a healthy life as much as possible. And into this, there isn't just a forest, but there are like rivers, streams, swamps, and ponds that were present really everywhere in Europe, that allowed fishing. It was also very, fish was like the most prelibate food that you could find, it was really important in the 13th century, into which society was really European society was changing really from that ancient agricultural world to sort of a financial, urban, monetary one. Still, a royalty gift. I mean, a gift that you could do to a king, like it was done, was to by I think it was a monastic communities, was to gift King Louis IX of France, Louis the Saint, with a very big fat pike. So what do you give what do you give a king with when he passes by your monastery for going to crusade, or I don't know where else, with a pike? You don't give him money, you give him something natural, a good, fat, juicy, and tasty fish to eat. Now that I think about fish, in the Benedictine rule, there is the prescription that you don't have to eat meat in certain days. So during the into the Cluny rule, the readaptation of the Benedictine rule into the Cluniac monasticism, and it was a way people criticized the eventual the moral decadence of these monastic communities, because by interpreting literally Saint Benedict's rule, those guys couldn't eat meat in those days, and they would obey the rule, but they could eat fish. So there was a lot of satire relatively to these monks that didn't eat meat that day, but they had like servants that served them at the table this very big, fat, spiced and tasty fish that in this sense was still something that could divert them from their spiritual needs, that at the base of and Benedictine society, and the Benedictine rule in this sense was in a world that into which fish had, I can't say disappeared, but in the country, who could really bring those big amount of fish that usually was fished along the coasts, and that could be found in markets and all. You could just fish some of them in a river, in a lake, but it was still such a poor world that maybe that was such a prelibate and rare food that it wasn't even inserted into the Benedictine rule, because it was given for granted that for that poor society it was even rare to eat a fish, and yet, as we see, streams and lakes and all were still also very important sources of food, and it's very interesting how basically anyone could access that. Already in Carolingian times, basically in certain areas where the Carolingian conquered, like these lords arrived and said, no, now the lake is mine, and now the river is mine, and you may fish in them, but you have to pay to me for doing that. So you understand how progressively this freedom was taken away from the lower classes, and together with the benefits that entailed. So, as we were saying, it would be a lot of gathering, uh, and many sources of food in this, of nutrition, and obviously also a crucial element. What was the main building material used at the time? Wood, obviously. So the forest was obviously serving that need for wood for the building of houses that at that time were almost entirely in wood, for warming, naturally, also together with coal, but also the construction of agricultural tools, of boats, of various items that you can think of. And naturally you have to think of the skill that exists at the time in already knowing it was still present, however, in the ancient world. I mean, it was something much more ancient, surely already from the Bronze Age existed, from which kind of about which kind of properties a certain type of wood had, compared to another. Think about, I don't know, the chestnut or the beech or the durmast. All different type of woods that have different characteristics and are fit for creating different type. Even think about weaponry. How it is important to have a certain flexibility, a certain resistance at the same time. So you have to imagine like literally millennia of experience that were handed down generation by generation orally, and that about which unfortunately we have lost so much, because many of our problems for understanding the history of technology pass exactly through this, that the majority of technical experience that was mostly spread in lower classes because the nobles lived off of those people's work, kind of went lost because it wasn't written down. And this is not something about smaller things. Still at the beginning of the 18th century, I don't know, Dutch shipmasters didn't write anything down. It's very famous when Peter the Great of Russia went to his journey into Europe to learn how to build ships to create a Russian navy, and he went to the Netherlands, and he acknowledged that there was nothing written, and it was a problem for him because he participated together with the ship workers in shipbuilding together with workers, but it was something so jealously preserved and only orally handed down. So he would go to Venice when instead a lot had been extensively written about the shipbuilding and galleys and all. Then eventually, I think war with I don't remember whether with Sweden or with the Ottoman Empire broke out, or even a rebellion in Russia, and he had to go back to Russia. But just for saying how this was normal up to a certain point. I mean, it's us today that we're not able to do anything if we don't have a manual. For those people, it was normal to know these things because someone taught them in their own family, usually. Another point that I find always interesting to discuss is how there were actually different type of forests themselves, in many ways, in the sense that this depends both on environmental reasons that can be influenced by a myriad of factors, as well as social reasons. It depends also on what kind of society is able to approach a forest whether it's already a very advanced, rich society or if it's still a primitive one. So you have to think that there were extremes of very largely, we can't say humanized forests, which means that were forests that were heavily cured by the local communities that kept them clean. And you have to think that sometimes in movies we see this kind of very wild and impenetrable forests, as if that was the average of forests at the time. Not at all. Since the Bronze Age, certain forests were completely cleaned by shrubs, small bushes, because local communities needed them to be that way for making pigs dwelling in them, because they needed to take away and they took wood from them because simply they had to have free passages into them, and all these reasons. And certain of these forests were already deforested in the sense that we could find they could be dotted by small clearing areas into which certain shepherds or coal men or the woodcutters lived in them, so quite tidy forests, let's say, quite very well ordered and well kept. That in this sense could be so just because maybe that community existed, then maybe a war came, everything got slaughtered, nobody took care of that forest anymore, so nature would claim back all those spaces that men had managed to carve for themselves. But there were as well forests that were extremely wild. So very virgin, unviolated forests that might have been penetrated by at least hunters or hermits, but people that in this sense do not make up a really habitual frequentate. They don't, they're very scanty. They're a very scanty presence that doesn't alter practically the environment. In this sense, I come back on monastic hagiography because even in the Bible there is a kind of we can say a naturalistic approach to nature, in the sense that mankind has to draw from nature but also to preserve it, not to alter it anymore. A sort of how you say that, an ecological perspective. That did definitely exist in the Christian world. So but this happened also in the pagan societies. If in polytheism, like the forest was conceived by ancient cultures, the world of certain deities that could, in this sense, benefit the hunter if he was respectous of the place. Usually forests were conceived as holy places. There were sanctuaries and shrines built up there, and therefore he could take just a small amount while hunting, and then respecting, in this sense, the generosity of the deity that lived or that even symbolized it in the same forest. So you really have to think of a mixed, especially in the early Middle Ages, of a world of transition, in this sense, into which paganism and Christianity were going in parallel and intermingling into relatively to the people's approach towards these forests that were definitely believed as in popular folklore, like the seat of beings like elves or witches or demons and all. So there is all the beautiful legends in the European folklore that talk about the forest and see the forest as think about all the Grimm brothers, how much the forest recurs into this kind of pivotal element of the country communities. And this is very interesting because now we're talking about Europe, but it happens really literally in every other society in the world, and it's even interesting to confrontate even the points of similarity into this. And relatively to this second type of forest, like the terribly vast and uncontaminated ones, you have to think that beyond the Rhine or the Elbe especially and the Danube, like all forests were practically in this way, and before the year 1000, maybe nobody had practically colonized them. And human communities had simply limited themselves to kind of get into one place, to exhaust the local resources from hunting and gathering for some months, like and then moving again. So this is really semi-nomadism, and that's why those societies were semi-nomadic, because they simply didn't have the potential to exploit those lands because of environmental reasons, chiefly temperature, but also and that therefore had obliged them to leave for up to 5,000 years ago. We were all hunter-gatherers, and we all lived in this fashion, so that was the norm. It was rather sedentary societies to be the exception at one point. So where does the main deforestation process actually start in this? Well, we can say that starting with the 8th century, there is a kind of coming back. I mean, seemingly people. I mean, today we usually attach this to climate change. Like, we think that major economical reprisals into these worlds were tied to the switch of temperature, which is perfectly plausible. Then, as I was saying, there are also political and social dynamics that allowed that, and we will try to explain really how the thing was taking place. From the 8th century, seemingly, especially in southern Europe, but a bit everywhere, there is seemingly a sort of reprisal, of economical reprisal, that is historically evidenced by the fact that trade starts to regain strength, which means that there was enough agricultural surplus for people to live off of exchange of the same surplus, to barter, trade, exchange in general. Because the base was still largely agriculture, I mean, it was all agricultural practically, like it had always been in pre-industrial society. So that's a good indicator. Trade is definitely a good indicator of such things. And this kind of started happening a bit everywhere. Like, you see in Italy there is more trade going on. Into France there is a greater form of a greater organization of estates, also thanks to the Carolingians that kind of expand and pioneer this new form of land organization that works as a flywheel for economics. in certain fashion. The same Franks began to expand into other lands that hadn't, especially in Germany, that were those lands that, as we were saying, hadn't been deforested yet in great part. It's a very timid reprisal, telling the truth. So what really happens is that there are not major changes, but there is simply a superficial extension of an extension of the surface of cultivated land into areas of Europe where this hadn't happened before. We know, in absence of documentary sources, we can study essentially the, archaeologically speaking, what kind of material is found there, like remains of wheat or wine. So we can say, at least here, people consumed this stuff. And maybe even if they hadn't produced it there, at least they could buy it. So maybe it was even a more florid possibility of buying products with a surplus and all. And usually to this economical reprisal, there is a process of an agricultural process of sowing, of seeding different kind of cereals that were practically obviously fit for different times of the years into which they were seeded. And we know this from the very precious either French or northern French or northern Italian polyptychs. Usually the Italian ones of the Po Valley, being a warmer area that kind of allowed and also a richer area on average, and more connected to international trade, sees in this sense the most sophisticated combination of these cultivations, and there were obviously even a different development in terms of what it was like in the ancient world. Because usually the ancient world would privilege wheat. In this time, the main type of cereal was the rye, the idea was kind of differentiating really the situation, because probably temperature was harsher, or at least society was less reliant on great structural ways of producing food, like it happened in the ancient latifundium, that was something on a very big scale that in this sense also operated in mass with more standardized means. This was something that was created really from the top, so from the bottom. So relatively poor people who were progressively trying to put all to make different attempts to better on the base of differentiating the cereals and all. So we're in different different strategies in this sense. There are certain materials, certain cereals like aside from like mile or sorghum, or broom corn, that and even certain varieties of oat that basically require being seeded into spring and then eventually being harvested into the summer. Mm. And then you can use other, and so this also meant a shorter amount, like having a few immediately just to secure the situation, rather than relying on more stable and kind of habitual and mono cereal cultivations. So the eventually grain reached once again the first place into this only during the 11th and 12th century, because in this sense society was the kind of land exploitation was becoming something more organized, more structural, like the feudal age at that point. All those lands were in the hands of a few people that in this sense managed and tried to simplify the whole process. That in turn shows that the small communities that instead were really trying hard to save on the base of these differentiated strategies weren't any more in control of that land. So even also viticulture, even before the year 1000, and especially in the 9th and 10th century, kind of increased also this time, and especially in the hilly regions, and the olive tree also spread, even if in certain, especially along in the Garda River, the Garda Lake, excuse me, and in other great alpine subalpine Pagan lakes. So it's not really when we figure this world, we see these improvements, we still have to think the world was very poor, very meager. I mean, even the crop rate was something very rarely going up to 3 to 1, and usually they were quite inferior to, they would be inferior to 2, which means that I don't know where I read it, but that the average medieval peasant, which the average medieval peasant is like a punch in the eye to every kind of precise historical study, but to give an idea roughly, is that a peasant in a life of work would basically have an increase of his resources by 4%. So basically it means that you work all your life, breaking your back by working land, and all you get at the end of a life of terrible fatigue is to have like 4% more of what you had when you began to work. So it's virtually nothing gained in a single life. That, however, really tells you the misery and of this world, and the how low the technological potential really was at the time. We're talking especially about the early and high Middle Ages, because we know that telling the truth, also this idea that from the year 1000 was sort of rebirth, that into which technology increased, it's kind of debated, in the sense that people say it was just a demographical increase that pushed people to find other areas for cultivation. But if you look at the crop rates, it seemingly they remained roughly the same. Of course, there were areas that were more fertile than others, maybe because the land was better, or simply because the weather was better. But it was something extremely rare at this point that the crop rate, as I was saying, was superior to 3 even in the low Middle Ages. So we really had to wait for centuries before things were practically better. So even the technological advancements of the year 1000 is really very relative as an explanation. Things were probably much more complicated. They had to do with the more with the kind of land organization, like the expansion of feudalism and the investments that the largest state's owner could practically achieve, and to with greater effect than small communities that were really all fragmented and not really working towards a unitary direction. Yeah, this is we can maybe conclude with this. I don't know if you liked the video. I personally find very interesting these topics. I don't know why, but I kind of like the world of the forest. Like the it's even fascinating in many ways. And if you like nature, if you like it, it's romantic, but also frightening sometimes. Nature is always dangerous and all. So if you like this video, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or just maybe subscribe to my channel if you want to receive news about other videos of mine. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye!